All right, so I'll start with a slide that I've been showing for the last 3 years, okay? And this is pretty much the crux of what we're trying to do with this research. All right, so when we're talking about soybeans and talking about fertilization, you heard Brian talk a little earlier on phosphorus of sufficiency levels versus crop removal and how to apply it. Well, if you don't know what you're removing in that crop, how are you going to know how to fertilize it? So this is from IP&I's database, okay? And basically what this is the average across the United States of what a soybean plant removes. All right, so you see about 3.3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, 1.2 pounds of K2O, and 0.7 pounds of P2O5. Doesn't sound like a lot till you put it on a yield level basis, okay? If you're growing 60 bushel soybeans, you're removing almost 200 pounds of N, 44 units of P2O5, and 72 units of K2O. Okay, keep in mind this is national average. And that less than 35% of producers are applying fertilizer, okay? In the 2017 Mississippi Extension budgets, 16% of the soybean budget was directly spent on mixed good fertilizers with soil testing in a medium level. Now, y'all have all seen these slides before, and y'all know that what we've been trying to do is recorrelate and calibrate our soil test for you, and we'll put a little bit of that up. Okay, so we know that we can positively respond to potassium in the state of Mississippi. The blue bars represent our responsive sites. The orange bars represent the non-responsive sites. What this says in soybean fields, if you don't, soil test says you don't need potassium, you do not need potassium. Okay? But if you do need potassium and the soil test calls for potassium, what we're seeing is about a 15% yield increase, okay, as represented by the blue bars, and somewhere around 80 to 120 units is going to get you the maximum level. We're also doing very similar work with phosphorus. Again, if the soil test says you don't need phosphorus, you don't need phosphorus. But when we do, we get about a 14% yield increase, or 8 bushels an acre. Okay, and if you see, there's basically that first step up of phosphorus, or that first application rate, gets us where we need to go, okay? So that first 30 units maximize our yield. Now, Brian talked a little earlier about phosphorus being tricky. I think you can see the difference in that. I feel like with where we're at in Mississippi, we're much better on making potassium recommendations than phosphorus recommendations. And again, that's part of it being so variable. With that said, we've been working really hard for the last 5 to 6 years on recorrelating and calibrating our nutrient management recommendations. But what we haven't done until recently, and Brian come on, is to try to reassess the total amount of nutrients taken up in soybeans plant. That first slide I showed, and I show in pretty much every talk I give, is a national average. Well, if you know anything about the national average for soybeans, it's going to be driven by Midwestern dryland production. So our questions was, how does soybeans take up nutrients in the Mid-South, in irrigated environments, and in both a high and low yielding environment, okay? So that's kind of what put this research to date. We know that we wanted to partition those nutrients, or try to determine in what organs in the plant those nutrients were stored in. We know from previous research that they're stored in, is taken up in 3 distinct phases and stored in multiple vegetative organs. So we wanted to key in on our V4 stage, which was about 30 days after emergence. As Trent talked about with corn earlier, that in the early part of that corn plant's life, it doesn't take up very much nitrogen. Well, the same is true for soybean. In the early part of that plant's life, it doesn't take up many nutrients. But after V4, we start increasing in our nutrient load. R2, which is full bloom, which has a high nutrient demand, and then when we get into seed field from R5 on, okay? And that work was done by Bender in the Midwest and showed some very interesting results. So we were trying to mimic what Ross had done in the Midwest in a Mid-South irrigated environment. So I'll show the 2016 data today. And if you look at this, we had 2 planting dates, okay? We had an April planting date and a May planting date. And we picked 4 cultivars within those planting dates, one representing the X bean, one representing a Liberty Link system, a traditional Roundup, and then a conventional system. So a side note to the project we were working on is we wanted to try to determine if nutrient uptake was different among some of these herbicide trait platforms. Okay. So what we observed in that, and I won't show today, is that across the trait platforms, nutrients were taken up very similar. Okay. So there wasn't a lot of difference. All right, so this slide is basically showing the yield levels. All right, so in an April planting bean, we're up around 80 bushel beans. With that May planting bean, we were right around 50 bushel beans. Okay, I think the exact planting dates on this was like April the 8th and May the 10th. All right, so that's setting up into the next part of slides where we're going with our actual uptakes. So this slide represents nitrogen uptake of an April planted bean. And because 4632s have been so prevalent in Mississippi the last several years, that's what we're going to show today, since all of the cultivars perform similarly. So on the y-axis you have total in uptake, and on the x-axis you have days after planting. Okay, the blue bar, or the blue area of the graph, is total nitrogen uptake in the plant. The green part, think leaves and stems and everything green on the plant. Okay, and the yellow or off yellow type is the grain. Okay, so what we see is about 60 days after planting, we really start increasing our nitrogen load in the plant, and then somewhere 80 days after planting, around at R5 stage, everything, the nitrogen in the plant really starts sinking to the grain. Okay, and we've taken upwards of 350 units of nitrogen out. So what we observed is 69% of the nitrogen in the plant was removed in a grain, or 3.3 pounds of N removed per bushel. That lines up very close and identical to the national average for nitrogen. Okay. When we look at P2O5 uptake, we see a slightly different curve, but again, very similar to nitrogen, P sinks to the grain in soybean very quickly, starting at about R5, with a total uptake of about 80 units of P2O5 in that soybean plant by R8. Excuse me. And if you look at the amount contained in the grain, there was approximately 66% of P2O5 removed in a grain, or about 0.65 pounds of P2O5 removed per bushel, which is slightly less than the national average. Okay, that national average was about 0.73. All right, so we're getting close. When we look at potash, and I harp on potash for the last several years, I think that's one thing that's really holding back our soybean yields in Mississippi. You can see by this graph in the blue areas that we luxury consume potash in soybeans, and soybean is a potash hog. If you look at the amount that goes to the grain, it's relatively low compared to potassium in relationship to what's taken up versus what's sinked in the grain. But because we take up so much potassium in a soybean plant, we remove a lot more. So although only 32% of the total K2O that was taken up in the soybean plant was removed in a grain, we're removing approximately 1.4 pounds per bushel. Okay. So you do the math on that on an 80 bushel crop, that's what these April planted beans were. It's a pretty significant amount taken out. All right, if we look very quickly at our May planted beans, one thing to note is when we planted in May, we had a shorter season over that duration, and we took up much less nutrients in total. For nitrogen, we took up about 276 pounds of nitrogen per acre in that plant. 52% of that was removed in a grain, or about 2.75 pounds being removed. Now keep in mind, per bushel. Now keep in mind that those April planted beans were 80 bushel beans. These are 50 bushel, okay, May planted beans. If you look at P2O5, very similar. We took up right around 60 pounds total and removed over 30 pounds in the grain. Right about 50% of the total P2O5 that was taken up was removed in the grain. Again, these May values are much lower than the national average. If you look at K2O, very similar. We are taking up to nitrogen in the plant. We're luxury consuming K. Took up 21% of the total K2O in the plant was removed in a grain, or about 1.1 pounds, okay? So I think those national averages that I talked about earlier, depending on how you grow and plant your beans, could be close or could be a little far off. All right, if you look at the total nutrient uptake and removal, April versus May, this kind of breaks it down. All right, remember the April beans were 82 bushels exactly, and the May beans were 50 bushels. We had 27% difference in nitrogen uptake, a 21% difference in P2O5 uptake, and a 16% difference in K2O. All right. If you look at the column on the right in the removal in pounds per day, this starts at reproductive growth, and on average, we were removing 3 to 4.5 pounds of nitrogen per day, a quarter to a third a pound of P2O5, and 3/4 to 1.6 pounds of K2O per day. Okay, so that's an enormous amount of nutrients we're removing out of the soil into that plant while we're growing that crop. Okay, and I'm going to leave you with some slides I left you with last year, in that we're removing a lot, but we're not replacing as much as we're removing. Okay, this is IP&I's new GIST system showing fertilizer sales versus cropping yields and removal. And for potassium, as 2012, we were at a net deficit of 125,000 tons. Okay. If you look at P2O5, the red areas, the delta areas, the orange areas, and the hills where we have concentrated agriculture production, we're removing a lot of P2O5. Okay. Very similar to K2O, we're at a net deficit, but we're only at a net deficit of 47,000. So I guess to leave you, I'll leave you with this that was on Twitter that the guys in Illinois that did the original work on this put on Twitter the other day, which was basically saying, guys, we need to fertilize. Okay, don't forget about taking care of your soil, and it'll take care of you. I thought it was interesting that this book was published in 1900, and it said if you put a fish under a hill of corn, you'll grow more corn. So this time of year, I always hear people say, I can't afford my fertilizer bill. We can help you afford your fertilizer bill through using the variable rate tools we have, through using soil testing, through using multiple philosophies and methods. Okay, so if you feel like you can't afford your fertilizer bill, give us a call, and we want you to be as profitable as you can.